This is a fictional story, created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, names, places, or events is purely coincidental. My ex hired someone to ruin my life online, but he didn't expect me to discover everything. There is this weird thing that happens when you stay too long with the wrong person. Your sense of what is acceptable slowly stretches until you barely recognize yourself anymore. And by the time you realize how far things went, the damage is already done, and you are standing in front of your own life like it is some stranger's apartment you accidentally walked into. That is basically how I ended up spending 6 years with a man who treated me like a walking wallet, a personal assistant, and an emotional punching bag, while everyone around us kept saying we were such a solid couple, and I smiled like an idiot because I was too ashamed to admit how ugly things really were behind the photos and the polite small talk. My name is Ainsley, by the way, and if you were sitting on my couch right now with a cup of something hot in your hand, this is exactly how I would start telling you everything, because there is just no cute way to introduce the fact that the person you loved used to compare you to every other woman who breathed near him while also making you pay for the things he wanted, so he would not have to be embarrassed by how you two looked in public. From the outside, we probably looked fine, maybe even good. Those couple pictures at dinners, birthdays, weekend trips paid mostly with my credit card. But inside my head, it was just this constant buzzing of fear that if I did not do enough, buy enough, agree enough, he would leave me and I would end up alone. And somehow that sounded worse than being miserable at the time. When we started dating, I worked as a receptionist at a medical office. Nothing glamorous, just phones, schedules, 1,000 people asking for appointments at the same time. But it was stable, and I was proud that I could pay my bills and still put a little money aside every month. It was one of several offices under a larger healthcare network, so transfers and internal postings were normal. He worked in sales for some vague tech thing I never fully understood, because every time I asked for details, he would roll his eyes and say I would not get it anyway, which should have been a red flag, but I called it confidence back then and laughed it off. Little by little, the conversations started turning into comments like how this other woman at some party dressed so much better than I did, or how his coworker's girlfriend always had her nails done and carried designer bags, and I would feel this hot embarrassment in my chest like I had shown up to a fancy dinner in sweatpants. At first it was just comments, then it was requests that did not sound like requests. More like performance evaluations. Things like, "Babe, you really need a better jacket, people notice these things," said in that tone that made me feel 12 years old again. He knew exactly how much I made. He saw my pay stubs when we did paperwork for our apartment rental. But somehow he always managed to make me feel like not buying something expensive was being selfish or lazy. I started using my little savings to get him the shoes he wanted, the watch he needed to look professional, the restaurant reservations he insisted on because some client might be there. And if I hesitated, he would go quiet and cold, and then throw around the word ungrateful, like I owed him the world just for being with me. Anytime I pushed back even a little, he had this way of turning everything into a threat without actually saying the words. He never said, "If you do not do this, I will leave." He said things like, "I guess some people just do not care about investing in their relationship," or "Other women would kill to have a man this honest about standards." And it sounds ridiculous when I repeat it out loud now. But at that point, I had already swallowed so much nonsense that I honestly believed I was the one failing. My friends started noticing I was more tired, more withdrawn, less available for simple things like a movie night or brunch. And my mother once asked if I was feeling sick because I had dark circles and had lost weight. But I just laughed and blamed work. What I definitely did not tell them was that I had drained most of my emergency savings into gifts, trips, and investments in our future that were really just things he wanted in the present. I also did not tell them about the way he would go on these emotional rants if I dared say no, how he would list everything he had ever done for me, including things that were basic, like driving me to the airport once, and then say he was tricked into being with someone who lacked ambition, that his friends' girlfriends acted like real partners, and I just acted like a burden. Every time he finished one of those speeches, I was left with this sticky feeling of shame that made it easier to say yes the next time he wanted something, because at least then we were not fighting and I could pretend we were normal. We lasted like that for 6 whole years, which makes me want to grab my past self by the shoulders and shake her. But the truth is, when you are in the middle of something like that, the days blur together and you start counting time in small cycles of drama and apology, not in milestones. He would be cruel, I would cry, he would ignore me. Then he would come back with this half-charismatic, half-condescending apology about how he just wanted to push me to be my best. And I would convince myself that maybe this was what love looked like when you were both stressed and trying to build a life. Meanwhile, my mental health was quietly slipping, my sleep was trash, and I had this knot in my stomach that never really went away. The beginning of the end came because of something so stupid it almost feels like a joke when I think about it. His phone broke, or at least that is what he said, that his phone just died overnight and would not turn on, and he needed to borrow mine for a few days while he got it fixed because he could not disappear from work contacts. I remember standing in our tiny kitchen, holding my phone while he went on and on about how urgent it was, and I had that little internal whisper that said, "This is weird." But I handed it over anyway because we had been together forever, and there was no reason not to trust him, right? He logged into his accounts on my device and promised he would log out again when his new phone arrived. Spoiler, he did not. He got his new phone a few days later, gave me mine back like everything was fine, and for a while I did not even think about checking anything because I was tired and trying to survive yet another week of his mood swings and demands. Then one night I was lying in bed scrolling on a social media app and I noticed a little notification popping up from his messages. Not my messages, his. He had never logged out. I should have put the phone down and just gone to sleep, or maybe I should have asked him directly in the morning. Something rational like that. But instead, something inside me snapped. I opened the messages. I scrolled. And in the span of maybe 10 minutes, my entire reality ripped itself into pieces. There were conversations with at least 8 different women from the last 2 years alone, some of them overlapping, some of them clearly thinking they were the only one. There were photos, there were good morning beautiful messages sent while I was in the shower getting ready for work. There were complaints about me, how I was clingy or cheap or too emotional, which was particularly funny considering I had just bought him an expensive jacket the week before, because he said people were starting to talk about how outdated his clothes looked. I sat there with my back against the headboard, my heart pounding in my ears, reading how he told one woman he stayed with me because I was stable and predictable and paid for things while she was his escape. I remember thinking, I'm not even a person to him. I am a payment plan. When he finally came home that night, I was not calm or composed or strategic. I was shaking and crying and holding the phone like it was a weapon and a lifeline at the same time. I shoved it at him and yelled something like, "Explain this." And he did not even try to deny the cheating. He sighed, rolled his eyes, and then somehow managed to turn the whole thing into a speech about how I was never enough, how I did not keep myself in shape, how I did not know how to be fun anymore, how he had needs, and I was lucky he had not left me years earlier. He said staying with me was a favor because most men in his position would have traded up a long time ago, and that if I had tried harder, he would not have had to look elsewhere. I stood there listening to a man who had just been caught cheating on me multiple times tell me that he had done me a kindness by tolerating me. I do not know what specifically snapped in my brain. Maybe it was the way he listed my supposed flaws like some kind of performance review, or the way he acted like I should be grateful for his betrayal. But something inside me finally hit that point where pain turns into something sharp and cold. I told him it was over. Not in a dramatic movie line way, just this flat, tired sentence. We are done. He laughed, of course, because he was convinced I would never actually leave. But when I started packing my things, the laughter turned into shouting, then into begging, then back into insults. I blocked his number while he was still yelling in the hallway and fell asleep on my friend's couch with my bag on the floor and my whole body buzzing like I had just run a marathon. The next few days were chaos. Paperwork, calls, sorting out the apartment lease, moving my stuff into a small one-bedroom that smelled like someone else's cooking and old carpet cleaner, but the decision itself stayed solid in my chest. I left that medical office within a month, put in for a transfer, and got out of that location as fast as I could. Partly because I could not stand the thought of running into him near our old neighborhood, and partly because I needed something drastic to mark that this was not just another fight we would circle back from. When my company posted an internal opening in another city for a similar administrative position, I applied, and when I got it, I took it as a sign that maybe, just maybe, I could start over somewhere my history did not show up in every corner. The night before I moved, though, I made one of those choices that come back later, like a ghost that refuses to stay buried. A friend of my ex showed up at the bar where I was having a goodbye drink with coworkers. He had always been around, one of those guys in the background at gatherings, nice enough, always quick with a joke, and he slid into the seat next to me with that look people have when they know more than they should. He said he had always noticed how badly I was treated, how my ex talked to me, how I paid for everything, and that he had wanted to say something for years but never did because he did not want to cause drama. Hearing someone else confirm what I had lived with for so long felt like validation. And validation can be a dangerous drug when you are hurt and drunk and packing up your entire life into cardboard boxes. We drank more than we should have, the I am fine kind of drunk that is just pain wrapped in laughter, and he kept saying things like, "You deserve better," and "I never understood why you stayed." And somewhere between the third and fifth drink, the conversation shifted from complaining about my ex to flirting. Part of me wishes I could tell you I stopped it, that I had some moral clarity in that moment, but I did not. I was angry, humiliated, and still wired from months of tension, and when he leaned in and kissed me, I kissed him back. One thing led to another, as people love to say when they do not want to spell things out, and I ended up spending the night with him. It was messy and confusing and absolutely not healing, and the second the sun came through the blinds, reality hit me like a truck. I left his place that morning with my clothes wrinkled and my head pounding, and there was this heavy guilt on top of everything else. Not because I owed my ex anything, but because I had crossed some weird internal line by touching someone from his world. I told myself it was just a stupid moment, fueled by alcohol and the need to feel wanted by someone who was not actively tearing me apart. And I promised myself it would be the last time I made a decision based on rage. 3 days later, I got into my car, loaded with boxes and trash bags full of clothes, and drove to my new city without saying goodbye to that guy or anyone else from that social circle. I blocked his number, his accounts, everything, and put him in the same mental box as my ex. Past, lessons, nothing more. Starting over in a new city sounds romantic when you see it on shows, but in real life it is a lot of paperwork, getting lost on unfamiliar streets, and sitting alone in a half-furnished apartment wondering if you made a terrible mistake. My new job was similar to the old one, still front desk, still answering phones and dealing with people who thought their appointment was more important than everyone else's. But at least no one there knew anything about my history. I could be just Ainsley, the woman who liked her coffee too sweet and organized her pens by color. Not Ainsley, the girl whose boyfriend treated her like an employee. That anonymity felt like breathing clean air after years of secondhand smoke. Even with the fresh start, though, the damage from those 6 years did not magically disappear. I developed this habit of checking my phone obsessively, even when no one was messaging me, just to make sure nothing terrible had happened without me noticing. I had trouble falling asleep unless I was absolutely exhausted, my mind replaying every fight, every insult, every moment I had ignored my instincts. I finally used my health insurance to schedule therapy, which I probably should have done years earlier, and sitting across from a stranger who listened without interrupting felt both terrifying and oddly comforting. I told her about the cheating, the money, the way he made me feel small, and at some point I admitted the thing with his friend right before the move. She did not judge me. She just asked why I thought I had done it. I cried harder at that question than at any memory of my ex. The years that followed were quieter in a way that felt both safe and lonely. I focused on work, on small routines, on grocery lists and bills, and keeping my plants alive. I went on a few dates here and there, mostly because friends from work pushed me into trying. But anytime someone started to get close, I found a reason to pull away. Either they were too clingy or not interested enough, too busy or too available, too similar to my ex, or too different. And eventually I realized I was still carrying his voice in my head, judging every interaction through the lens of his standards. It took me more than one therapy session to admit that I was terrified of trusting anyone again. Because what if I missed the red flags and ended up right back where I started, except older and even more tired? Life went on like that until my company posted an internal opening in the main office back in my original city, a promotion with better pay and more responsibility. When my supervisor pulled me aside and said she thought I should apply, my first instinct was to say absolutely not, no way, never going back there. But the practical part of me heard the words, higher salary and leadership position, and started making lists in my head. I had worked hard, built a solid reputation, and the reality was that this was the kind of opportunity that did not show up every year. I spent a whole night sitting on the floor of my living room, staring at the email with the job description, going back and forth between fear and ambition. In the end, ambition and the need to feel like I was moving forward won. I applied, I interviewed, and when they offered me the position, I accepted with my stomach twisted in knots. Moving back felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone knew lines from a play I did not want to be in anymore. But the rational part of me kept saying that years had passed, people moved on, and I was not exactly a celebrity. No one was keeping tabs on my life. I told myself that I could control where I went, that I did not have to set foot anywhere near my old neighborhood, that I was returning as a different version of myself, with therapy under my belt and a slightly tougher skin. When I finally drove back into the city with a moving truck trailing behind me, around 4.5 years had passed since I had packed everything into my car and left, and it was like seeing an old friend and an ex at the same time, familiar and slightly nauseating. I spent months just settling back in, rebuilding routines, before I even felt ready to date again. I rented a small house in a different area than where I had lived before, far enough that I would not run into the grocery store where I used to shop, or the coffee place where my ex liked to sit and pretend he was working. I learned new streets, new shortcuts, new restaurants. At work, the main office buzzed with a different kind of energy, busier, louder, more chaotic, and for the first time in a long time, people looked at me like I was someone who had authority, not just the girl at the front desk. That was also where I met the man who became my husband. His name was Ethan. He worked in another department, and we ended up chatting at one of those mandatory team-building things where they make you wear name tags and participate in awkward icebreaker games. He was direct in a way that was almost disarming. No mysterious half-answers. No playing hard to get. He just asked for my number and then actually used it, calling when he said he would, showing up when we made plans. After years of chaos, that consistency felt both suspicious and deeply attractive. He was not perfect, obviously, but he was kind to waiters. He listened when I talked, and he never made jokes at my expense in public just to get a laugh. Of course, because trauma is rude, I did not magically become a calm, trusting person just because a good man showed up. Every time he took a little longer than usual to reply to a message, this cold dread slid into my stomach, and I would have to talk myself down from spiraling. If he complimented another woman's outfit in a harmless way, my brain immediately flashed back to my ex's comparisons. I tried really hard not to let those reactions show, but sometimes they slipped out in sarcastic comments or passive-aggressive silence, and then I would feel guilty for punishing someone new for someone old's crimes. He noticed, obviously. He would ask what was wrong, and I would shrug and say I was just tired, which was technically not a lie, just not the full truth. The first time I met his family, his mother made a joke, the kind of thoughtless comment people toss around when they do not really know your history. She said something like, "So you are the girl who ran away to another city after a breakup. Huh, some people just cannot handle real commitment." I laughed politely while my face burned, and he squeezed my knee under the table in this quiet apology that told me he did not agree with her. Still, it took everything in me not to retreat completely after that, because once again I was being reduced to a story I had not even told them. Over time, his family warmed up, mostly because he made it clear he was serious about me, and I slowly stopped feeling like I was being interviewed for the role of good enough partner. We dated for around 8 months before he proposed. It was not some extravagant thing with fireworks and choreographed friends, just us in our living room eating takeout when he pulled out a ring and said he wanted to build a life with me, the kind where we both actually showed up instead of playing roles. I cried, obviously, because I cry for everything, and I said yes, even though a small, terrified part of me whispered that I might mess this up like everything else. We got married in a small ceremony with his family, a few of my coworkers, and a couple of old friends who had actually stayed by my side after my breakup. And then we bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind with kids riding their bikes in circles and people waving when they passed by. It was one of those suburban neighborhoods with a homeowners association that sent out polite but passive-aggressive letters about trash cans, noise, and what time you brought things to the curb. The house needed work, a lot of work. The floors creaked, the kitchen cabinets were older than both of us, and the paint looked like it was holding on purely out of spite. But walking through those rooms with him, planning where we would put a couch or a dining table, felt like building a future brick by brick. We spent weekends ripping up carpet, painting walls, and arguing over things like whether we really needed a fancy light fixture in the hallway. He made it fun most of the time, putting on music, dancing with a paint roller in his hand, and I tried to match his energy. But there were moments when the creak of the floor or the slam of a door would send my nervous system into high alert for no logical reason. I did not tell him about the night with my ex's friend. That secret sat in the back of my mind like a splinter I kept convincing myself was too small to worry about, especially compared to everything else. I told myself it did not matter because it had been years before we met, that it would only cause unnecessary hurt and drama now, that it was just a stupid, impulsive decision made by a version of me who barely exists anymore. Every time I thought about bringing it up, I imagined the look on his face, the questions, the connection he might draw to who that man was, and I shoved it back down, promising I would maybe talk about it in therapy again instead. Spoiler, I did not. Those first months of marriage were this weird mix of real happiness and quiet panic. I loved him. I really did. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had a partner instead of a supervisor. But the idea of having something so good made me nervous in a way I could not fully explain. It was like walking around holding a glass vase in a crowded room, constantly aware that one wrong move could shatter everything. If he came home late from work, the rational part of me said traffic or deadlines, but another part remembered my ex's lies and sat there watching the clock with my heart pounding. Sometimes I would check his social media activity, not because he had ever given me a reason to doubt him, but because my brain refused to accept that healthy relationships existed without surveillance. About 4 months after our wedding, I was at work finishing up some reports when my phone started buzzing nonstop. First, it was one call from my husband, then another, then a series of texts. Call me now. Come home. It is urgent. My stomach dropped. I stepped into an empty office and called him back, already bracing for news of an accident or some family emergency. But his voice was tight and furious, not devastated. He said, "You need to get home right now. There is someone here, and he is saying things about you in front of everyone." I could hear shouting in the background, a man's voice, and then my husband's voice again, louder, telling him to calm down. I grabbed my bag without even shutting down my computer and drove home like my car was on autopilot. When I turned onto our street, there were neighbors outside, the kind of little crowd that forms whenever something dramatic happens in a quiet neighborhood. My heart hammered as I parked crookedly and walked up the driveway, trying to piece together what could possibly be going on. Standing on our front yard was a man holding the hand of a little kid, maybe 3 years old, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. At the time, I was too shocked to think it through. But later it hit me that he had brought her on purpose. She was his daughter, and he had her with him that afternoon anyway, because it was his day with her. And dragging her into my driveway like a prop worked perfectly for the story he was trying to sell. Nothing makes a woman look colder in front of neighbors than being accused of abandoning a child while the child is standing right there. It took me a second to recognize him, because time had rounded out his face and stress had etched new lines there. But when he turned toward me and smiled in that way that made my skin crawl, I realized who he was. It was the friend of my ex, the one from the bar. The one night I had spent all those years trying to forget. He pointed at me and raised his voice, loud enough that the neighbors could hear every word. "There she is," he said. "There is the woman who promised she would be a mom to this kid and then disappeared like we were nothing." I froze. My husband turned to look at me, confusion and anger written all over his face, and the ground might as well have opened up. The man kept talking, saying I had spent weeks living with him and his child, that I had called myself a co-parent, that I had told the little kid I would always be there, and then one day blocked their numbers and never wrote again. His words painted this picture of me as some monster who toyed with a child's feelings for fun and then discarded her. I tried to speak, to say that it was not true, that we had spent exactly one night together and I had never even met that kid before. But the sentences got stuck in my throat. My husband asked me, his voice low and tight, "Did you know him?" And for a split second, I thought about lying, just to make the yelling stop. Instead, I nodded and managed to choke out that I had known him years ago. Briefly. That was all I could get out before the man cut me off again, accusing me of pretending not to remember, saying I was lying because I was embarrassed in front of my new perfect life. Neighbors were whispering. Someone was filming on their phone, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears like someone had turned on a loud fan. Eventually, my husband got between us physically and told the man to leave, that this was not the way to handle whatever grievances he thought he had. But not before the man took out his phone, snapped photos of our house, our yard, maybe even the street number. He said, "You will hear from me and everyone will know what you did," and then walked off with the child who kept looking back at me like I was supposed to say something. Later, I realized how he got our names and details so fast. Our address is public record. My husband's profile was wide open, and he had years of mutual contacts from my old life to connect the dots and figure out exactly who to tag and where I worked. And later, our lawyer said it was pretty obvious he had not found us by luck. People do not usually get that specific without someone feeding them details from the inside to help narrow everything down to our street, our house, and my job. I went inside on shaking legs, sat on the edge of our couch, and tried to breathe around the pressing weight in my chest. My husband closed the door, locked it, and then turned toward me with a look I had never seen on his face before. Not directed at me anyway. Distrust. He asked me to explain. I tried. I told him about the bar, about the drinks, about the stupid impulsive choice I made right before moving, but the words sounded flimsy and pathetic in that living room that we had painted together. He asked if I had ever met the child. I said no. He asked why the man would say I had lived with them, why he would invent something so specific. And I honestly did not have an answer. Maybe he is trying to get money or attention, or I do not know, I said, which did not help. I could see the part of him trying to believe me, fighting with the part that had just heard a stranger call me a liar in front of our whole street. The next day, things went from horrible to somehow worse. The man posted this long, dramatic story on a social media app, naming me and my husband, tagging people from our old circles, painting me as some cold-hearted woman who had inserted herself into a single dad's life, played house with his kid, promised to be a mom, and then abandoned them without a goodbye. He added pictures of the child, including one taken right outside our house with the caption, "She just wanted to see her again." He wrote about how trauma like that scars a kid for life, how I had broken something innocent, and then he asked people to share, to hold me accountable. The story blew up in ways I did not even know were possible in such a short amount of time. Someone reposted it in a local neighborhood group, other people shared the screenshots, and a couple of bored coworkers tagged my company under it like they were watching a show. Former acquaintances I had not spoken to in years started commenting, things like, "Wow, I am so disappointed. I always thought she was nice." And, "Honestly, this tracks. She always seemed selfish." People messaged my husband, asking if it was true. Some of them were clearly enjoying the drama, treating my life like a show, but others sounded genuinely disgusted with me, like I had kicked a puppy on camera. I did the one thing you are never supposed to do in those situations. I responded in the comments. I wrote this clumsy, frantic defense saying his story was a lie, that we had spent one night together, and that was it. That I had never met the kid before. And predictably, people took my tone as proof that I did not care about the child at all. At work, I tried to act like nothing was happening, but that lasted about one morning. By lunch, people were whispering, and by the next day, I got an email from Human Resources asking me to come in for a meeting. Sitting in that bland gray room with the HR representative and my manager, listening to them talk about online harassment and potential reputational risk, felt like being 15 again in the principal's office. Except this time, my job, my health insurance, my entire stability depended on how I handled it. They showed me printed screenshots of the post, asked if I felt safe, if I had any idea whether this man might escalate. I felt both exposed and weirdly grateful that they were taking it seriously, even if a part of me wondered if they were mentally already calculating how hard it would be to replace me. In the end, they did not punish me or write me up. They logged everything, looped in security, and told me to forward every new message or screenshot straight to them and to our lawyer. I kept my job. Technically, nothing changed on paper, but walking into that building after that meeting never felt the same again, because I knew my name had been in emails for all the wrong reasons. When I got home that night, my husband had already seen everything. He had stayed off social media all day, but people kept sending him the link, texting him, asking if he was okay. And eventually he caved and read the entire thing. We hired a lawyer because he insisted there had to be some line where defamation kicked in, some law that protected people from being dragged like this. The lawyer listened to our story, scrolled through the post, shook his head and said it was messy. Without clear evidence, it would end up being one person's word against another's, and courts did not always care about emotional truth, only about what could be proved. He said we could send a formal letter demanding that the man take down the post and retract his statements. But if the man refused, going further would be expensive, slow, and not guaranteed. That night was the first time my husband pulled away from me physically. I climbed into bed, reached for him the way I always did, and he stayed on his side, eyes open in the dark. When I asked if he was okay, he said he did not know. He kept his voice calm, but the distance between us felt wider than the whole bed. He said he was angry with that man, obviously, but he was also angry that there were pieces of my past I had never told him about, that he had to find out from a stranger that I had been with someone connected to my ex. I tried to explain that it had felt shameful, that I had convinced myself it did not matter anymore, that it was not some secret relationship I had hidden, just a stupid night. But the hurt in his eyes told me that for him, the betrayal was not in the act itself as much as in the fact that I had kept it a secret. The man who had started all this did not back down. After ignoring our lawyer's letter for a few days, he messaged my husband directly through the app, saying he wanted to share the full truth, and that my husband deserved to hear it from him. He hinted that there were more details I had not told my husband, that he had proof of an extended involvement, that if my husband wanted to know what kind of person he had married, he should meet him alone. My husband showed me the message, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitch. We argued, of course. He asked if there was more I was hiding. I said no, repeatedly, and I meant it. But it is amazing how quickly doubt can spread once it has one crack to crawl through. Our quiet street suddenly did not feel so quiet anymore. Our HOA sent us a formal notice about disturbances and unwanted attention, basically saying the scene on our front lawn had generated complaints. Someone anonymously called the police for a wellness check on me, apparently pointing to things they had seen about me online. And one afternoon there was a knock at our door, and 2 officers stood there asking if I was safe, if I had plans to hurt myself or someone else. Standing on my own front porch explaining to strangers in uniform that yes, I was mentally exhausted, but no, I was not actively a danger to myself, might be one of the most humiliating things I have ever done. The next morning, on our lawyer's advice, we filed our own report and sent the case number to the HOA with a formal response saying we were the ones being harassed, not the ones creating drama for fun. After that, they quietly backed off and stopped treating us like we were the problem just because our mess was louder than everyone else's gossip. As the days turned into weeks, I stopped going to the grocery store at normal hours and started shopping late at night, when fewer people were around. I avoided the gym because I could not handle the idea of someone recognizing me from that post and whispering behind the weight racks. At work, some of my coworkers were supportive, sending me memes or little messages checking in, but others went quiet and distant, suddenly too busy to chat during breaks. I lost my appetite, slept badly, and found myself jumping every time my phone buzzed, convinced it was going to be some new attack or some notification from HR saying they had decided it was best to part ways. Then, just when I thought the whole thing could not get any more twisted, the man sent me a direct message, not my husband. Me. He wrote that he was willing to reconsider his posts and maybe share a different version of the story if I could help him out. He never used the word money in the first sentence, but by the third one, it was clear. He said he had fallen behind on bills, that publishing his experience had cost him opportunities, that if I made a good faith financial gesture, he could take the post down, post an update saying we had worked things out and let this go. Reading that message, I felt something in me shift again. That same place where fear and anger mix into something sharper. I showed the message to my husband and our lawyer. My husband's first reaction was to say absolutely not, that paying him would look like admitting guilt, that we were not going to reward someone for dragging us through the mud. Our lawyer, though, leaned in and asked if we had saved the entire conversation, every screenshot, every notification. When we said yes, he smiled in this tight, satisfied way that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like maybe the tide was turning even a little. This, he said, pointing at the message, this is basically blackmail. Now we are not just dealing with a he said, she said story. Now we have him asking for money in exchange for stopping the damage he started. He set up a meeting with the man at his office, telling him there might be a way to resolve things, and that it would be better for everyone to talk face to face. I went, even though every cell in my body wanted to hide under a blanket instead, because I needed to see him in a space where he was not performing for an audience. He showed up in a wrinkled shirt, looking more nervous than he had on my front lawn, and his eyes darted around the room like he was looking for a hidden camera. The lawyer had the messages printed out in a neat stack on the table. He walked through the timeline, through the original post, the comments, the screenshots, then the direct messages asking for money. It was almost funny, in a dark way, how quickly the man's story started to crumble under basic questions. When asked for specific dates of when I supposedly lived with him and the child, he gave answers that did not line up with my move, with my job records, with anything. He claimed I had been picking up the kid from daycare for months, but could not remember the name of the daycare. He insisted he had messages where I promised to be forever mom, but could not produce a single one when asked, mumbling something about a lost phone or a deleted account. Meanwhile, the evidence of him asking for money to adjust the narrative sat glaring on the table between us. Our lawyer told him flatly that that message asking for money to adjust the narrative would be attached to a police report that same day, and that once it was filed, it stopped being drama and became evidence that people like his employer and any judge looking at parenting time could eventually see. That was when his confidence really started to collapse. The man's bravado melted. He went from defensive to panicked in a matter of minutes, sweating, stammering, looking anywhere but at me. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, he admitted that he had been paid to lie. Those were his exact words. Paid to lie. He said my ex had reached out to him almost a year earlier, asking about me, asking if we had stayed in touch, if he knew where I worked, where I lived now. When the man said no, my ex filled in the blanks, telling him I had remarried, that I seemed smug about my new life, that I had acted like a victim during our breakup when really I had used him. Then he had made an offer. Money in exchange for making my life as uncomfortable as possible. The idea was to show my true colors to everyone around me, to knock me down a peg. He wired the man $15,000 as an advance and promised another $15,000 once the fallout started. Hearing those numbers, those details, I felt nauseous. $30,000 to destroy my reputation and stab my marriage in the heart. $30,000 he apparently had available to spend on revenge after years of telling me we could not afford basic things unless I paid. The man said my ex had even helped draft the original post, feeding him lines that sounded emotional and specific, making up the co-parent narrative and the supposed weeks I had spent with the child. He had coached him on how to present it so people would side with him, had told him exactly which people to tag to maximize impact, including some of my coworkers he had never even met. The only reason the man was admitting any of this, aside from the fact that our lawyer had just explained how legal consequences worked, was that things had started collapsing in his own life. His girlfriend had found out what he had done after seeing the messages about money on his phone, and she had threatened to leave. His job had started asking uncomfortable questions about why his name was tied to an online harassment complaint. Suddenly, the easy cash he had taken to play villain in someone else's story did not seem so easy anymore. Anyone else might think I should have felt some satisfaction hearing him squirm, but sitting there in that office, all I felt was this deep, exhausted heaviness. This man had agreed to hurt me for money. My ex had orchestrated it because he could not stand that I had moved on, and my entire life had been turned upside down because two grown men decided their bruised egos were worth more than my stability. I looked at him and said, "Do you even understand what you did?" He stared at his hands and muttered something about needing the money, about not thinking it would go this far, about assuming I would just cave or pay or apologize. Our lawyer recorded his statement, with his consent, and he pulled up the transfer receipts on his banking app. Screenshots, dates, amounts, everything, and our lawyer made it very clear those screenshots were just the start and would be checked against the official records next. It was already enough to move this out of the territory of hurt feelings and into something the system would actually pay attention to. Legally, we finally had something substantial, but emotionally, the damage was already there, scattered across my marriage, my job, my friendships. The man agreed to remove the posts and to write a retraction, but I knew even before he did it that you cannot unring a bell. People had seen the original story, had felt their outrage, had made their judgments, and most of them were not going to come back around to read the boring update saying, "Oops, this was actually a lie." When I got home that night, I opened a blank note on my phone and wrote a short statement. No begging, no dramatic explanations, just a calm version of the truth, that someone who had a grudge against me had paid another person to publish lies, that we had obtained proof of that arrangement, that the matter was being handled, and that I would not be discussing it further. I posted it privately to the people who had been tagged, to a few group chats, to coworkers who had asked, and then I logged off. Whoever wanted to believe me would. Whoever did not, well, they had already shown me how quickly they were willing to toss me aside when it made them feel morally superior. Some people did reach out to apologize, to say they were sorry for doubting me, that they had been caught up in the drama. I said thank you where it felt appropriate, but I did not rush to patch things up. There are apologies that come from real regret, and apologies that come from discomfort with being on the wrong side of a story. And I was too tired to sort through which was which. A few people, including someone I had considered my best friend, stayed silent. No apology, no explanation, just a quiet fade out. She had been one of the loudest voices in the comments, saying things like, "I thought I knew you," and "This breaks my heart," and apparently that was the last chapter of our friendship. I decided I was not going to chase anyone. If you throw me under a moving bus at the first bad headline, you do not get a second chance to call yourself my friend. I deleted her number and blocked her on every app I could think of so I would not be tempted to scroll back through what we used to be when I got nostalgic and lonely. My ex, of course, decided that this was the perfect time to send me an email. The first one was full of denial, claiming that the man was lying, that he had never paid him, that this was some bizarre revenge plan directed at him too. He said he was shocked that anyone would believe he could do something like that, which would have been hilarious if it were not infuriating. When I did not respond, he sent another message a few days later that took a completely different tone. Suddenly he was sorry. Suddenly he missed what we had. Suddenly he was quoting old memories and saying he had acted out of hurt because seeing me happy with someone else had broken him. He wrote that his current wife had found out about the whole mess and that their life was falling apart. He begged me to tell her that he was not a monster, that I had already forgiven him years ago, that the man he had paid was exaggerating. The audacity of asking me to fix the mess he had created in his own marriage after paying $30,000 to ruin mine was almost impressive in a sick way. I deleted the email without responding. I had already lost enough sleep and dignity over him. I refused to spend one more second acting as his free crisis management consultant. His wife reached out separately, though, with a message that was the opposite of his. Calm, direct. She said she had discovered financial irregularities, that she had found messages between him and the man who had harassed me, that she knew I did not owe her anything, but she wanted to understand what kind of person she had married. I talked to our lawyer before responding, and he told me to be honest but avoid sharing anything about our legal strategy. So I agreed to meet her in a public place, a little coffee shop downtown, just two women who had loved the same man at different points, comparing notes. She showed up looking tired in that deep, bone-level way I recognized instantly. We sat across from each other, and I told her what I had been through with him, the financial manipulation, the constant comparisons, the cheating. I told her about the $30,000, about how he had used that money not to pay off debt or help anyone, but to stage a smear campaign against his ex. Her face went paler with every sentence, and she nodded along, occasionally adding her own examples of similar behavior in their marriage. By the time we finished, there was this eerie sense of closure, like we had both been reading different chapters of the same book and finally got a complete copy. She filed for divorce soon after that. I found out through a mutual acquaintance who texted me a screenshot of some paperwork I did not ask for. Apparently, in his professional world, the whispers about his personal life were starting to seep into his reputation. The idea of what might happen to him career-wise if the full story became public terrified him enough that he was suddenly very flexible when our lawyer approached him with the records of the bank transfers and the recorded confession from the man he had paid. Faced with the choice between a drawn-out legal battle where everything might become public record and a settlement that would make this go away more quietly, he chose the latter. Our lawyer sat us down at his office one more time and laid out the offer. My ex was willing to pay a substantial amount and sign a formal retraction drafted by the attorneys, acknowledging that the story was false, and agreeing to have every post and copy of it taken down wherever they could reach. The retraction itself was not some dramatic public confession, but it was a legal document with his signature on it, plus a written no-contact agreement so he could not circle back and try anything like this again. At work, the whispers finally started to die down once people realized there was an actual legal retraction, and not just my word against some angry posts. The man who had carried out the harassment was facing his own separate consequences for the attempt to shake us down for money, which frankly was between him and the system now. The question was how far we wanted to push things. On paper, the obvious answer might have been as far as possible, hold them both accountable to the absolute maximum. In reality, we were exhausted. The constant stress had worn down both of us. Therapy bills were piling up. My appetite still came and went in waves, and my husband and I had spent far too many nights lying side by side in silence, each trapped in our own thoughts. My husband admitted, voice rough, that what hurt him most was not just that someone had lied about me, but that I had kept that night with the man a secret for so long. We talked about it in couples counseling, about trust, about transparency, about how my instinct to hide things out of shame ended up creating the very distance I was afraid of. It was not a magical fix, but being in a room with a third person forcing us to say the quiet parts out loud helped. We went through this weird stretch where every small disagreement felt like it was secretly about the big thing, even when we were just arguing about dishes or whose turn it was to take the trash out. I hated how tense the house felt, but also could not pretend everything was fine and go back to stuffing my feelings down like I used to. Therapy made us lay out all the tiny resentments we had both collected. The evenings where he pulled back, and I assumed it meant he was going to leave. The mornings where I shut down and he decided it meant I did not care. It was uncomfortable as hell sitting there saying out loud, I did not tell you about that night because I was ashamed and I was sure you would see me the way I still sometimes see myself. There were sessions where we left in total silence and I went straight to the shower so I could cry with the water running. Not because he had been cruel, but because hearing my own patterns described back to me was exhausting. I had to admit that I was not just a victim in this part of the story. Hiding things to keep the peace had been my favorite survival strategy, and it had been quietly poisoning the trust between us long before the guy ever showed up on our lawn. He had to admit that sometimes he wanted everything to be so straightforward and logical that he steamrolled my feelings. When he got scared, he pulled away instead of saying, "I am scared," and then expected me to magically know what was going on in his head. None of that is glamorous. It is just two people sitting on a couch talking about how messy their brains are, while a therapist occasionally asks, "And what did that make you feel like?" in a voice that somehow keeps everything from exploding. Slowly, though, little things shifted. He started narrating his thoughts more, saying things like, "I am quiet because I am overwhelmed, not because I am angry at you." As silly as it sounds, hearing that out loud made it easier for me not to spiral. I started catching myself before going straight to secrecy, telling him when something from the past was triggered, instead of waiting until I was already halfway down a rabbit hole of worst-case scenarios. We made stupid little rules, like no reading heavy emails in bed, and no checking social media when we were already upset, because we had learned the hard way that bad news hits twice as hard when you are lying in the dark trying to fall asleep. It was not a montage. There was no inspirational song playing in the background, but day by day, the air in the house felt a tiny bit less thick, like maybe we were not just surviving the fallout anymore, but actually building something sturdier on top of the rubble. In the end, we decided to accept the settlement with my ex. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was a practical decision in a world where energy and money are not unlimited. He agreed to pay $60,000, money his wife later told me he scraped together with a rushed personal loan and a bonus he was terrified of losing, and to sign the formal retraction our attorneys had drafted. The statement was emailed and mailed to every single person who had been tagged in the original post. My family, his family, mutual friends, my workplace. Some people had already heard a watered-down version through gossip, but seeing the confession in his own words hit differently. A few more apologies showed up in my inbox after that, from people who finally understood how manipulated they had been. I acknowledged them politely, but kept my distance. You learn a lot about someone by how fast they jump on a bandwagon when they think you are the villain. We used the money in the most unglamorous way possible. We paid off the legal fees that had been quietly draining our savings. We finished repairs on the house, finally fixing the leaky roof and replacing the ancient cabinets that had been on our to-do list since we moved in. There was no celebratory shopping spree, no revenge vacation to show off on social media, just a slow return to some version of normal that felt fragile and earned. The man who had carried out the harassment signed his own agreement, including a formal apology and a promise to never contact us again. He broke that promise once with a desperate message asking if there was any way I could help him now that his life was a mess. I blocked him without replying. I had run out of sympathy for men who created disasters and then looked for women to mop them up. Last I heard, he took some kind of deal that kept him out of jail, but forced him to take everything down, agree in writing to stay away from us, and stick to a list of boring probation-type rules that kept our names out of his mouth for good, which was really all I cared about at that point. The part that still made me sick was that a kid had been dragged into all of this and used like a prop in someone else's revenge story. Our lawyer mentioned that Child Protective Services had flagged the situation after someone reported a child being used in a harassment scheme. And last I heard, his girlfriend had full custody and the kid was no longer being dragged into his mess. After the formal retraction went out and the paperwork was filed, Human Resources eventually marked the situation as resolved, and no one ever brought it up again in any official meeting. As for the neighbors who had stood outside that day watching everything unfold like it was free entertainment, most of them eventually went back to polite nods and small talk once they realized we were not the drama they thought we were. A few even tried awkward apologies in passing, mumbling something about not knowing the full story, but we kept things surface level. The street went back to being quiet. Just another block where people walked their dogs and argued about trash cans and recycling, and that was more than enough for me. I also quietly cleaned house in my personal life. I stopped following, messaging, or meeting with anyone who had publicly sided against me. That included my old best friend, a couple of cousins, and even a neighbor who had gleefully repeated the worst parts of the original story to anyone who would listen. When they tried to slide back into my messages with casual, "Hey, how are you?" texts, I left them on read. I realized that I had spent too much of my life trying to prove myself to people who would never actually stand by me when things got hard. Losing them hurt, but keeping them would have hurt more. My ex lost more than money. Slowly, his shiny image faded. People found out about the cheating, the manipulation, the extremes he had gone to for revenge. The mutual acquaintance who had kept me updated told me he had moved out of his nice house into a smaller place. that his weekends were suddenly much quieter now that he was no longer being invited to the same parties, that his ex-wife had no problem telling anyone who would listen exactly what he had done. I did not dance with joy at his downfall, but I will not lie and pretend it did not feel like some kind of cosmic balance to see at least a fraction of what he had thrown at me ricochet back in his direction. As for my husband and me, we did not snap back to before like nothing had happened, because that is not how real life works. We went to therapy, both together and separately. We learned how to talk about ugly things without using them as weapons. I had to face the part of me that still believed I was always one mistake away from losing everything, that hiding my worst moments was safer than letting someone see the whole messy picture. He had to face the part of himself that wanted everything to be logical and neat, that struggled with the idea that good people can still make terrible decisions when they are hurt. There were nights when we argued, when old wounds flared up, and it felt like maybe love was not enough to get us through this. But then there were mornings when we sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around mugs, and remembered why we had chosen each other in the first place. A while after the legal dust settled, I found out I was pregnant. It did not turn everything into a fairy tale, it just shifted the weight I was carrying. Suddenly, it was not only about what had been done to me, or what people believed about me, it was about the kind of house a little person was going to grow up in, and what I was willing to tolerate in that house. The past did not disappear. It sat there in the corner like an old box we still trip over sometimes. But at least now we know what is inside of it, and we are not pretending it is not there. The biggest change was not that everyone finally knew the full story. It was that I stopped auditioning for the role of good woman in other people's heads. Some people believed the retraction, some did not. Some just moved on to the next piece of drama. It honestly does not matter anymore. What matters is that in my actual life, at my actual table, I have a partner who looked at all of it and still chose to stay and do the work with me, and a chosen circle of people who care more about how we treat each other than about what a comment section once decided. If you had told me back when I was pouring my paycheck into my ex's closet that one day he would be the one paying to fix what he broke, and I would be the one deciding how far to push, I would have laughed in your face. I am not some enlightened hero now. I still flinch at raised voices, and I still avoid streets that feel like landmines. But I also have a home that has our names on it for the right reasons, a family that is built on facts instead of performance, and a story that belongs to me instead of to the loudest liar in the room. For where I started, that is enough. And on most days, it feels like a bigger win than anything I ever imagined when I thought love meant never making anyone uncomfortable.